We had developed a campaign that featured a bat, the nocturnal animal, like Batman, that, as the key visual. And the research that we had to do, because the client insisted, came back unfavorable. So the research came back unfavorable. The focus group hated the bat. We launched the campaign with the recommended visual, recommended by the externals, and the performance was horrible. So we had done everything right, in theory. We listened to the advice, we changed it, and it was horrible. So in a really heroic moment, the client decided to be courageous and launch the original visual for an A/B test. And guess what? The original visual outperformed the recommended version, and not just a little, by a significant margin.
Welcome to How I Made It in Marketing from Marketing Sherpa. We scour pitches from hundreds of creative leaders and uncover specific examples, not just trending ideas or buzzword-laden schmaltz, real-world examples to help you transform yourself as a marketer. Now, here's your host, the Senior Director of Content and Marketing at Marketing Sherpa, Daniel Burstein, to tell you about today's guest.
I love the creative process. It's one of the reasons why I've enjoyed my marketing career so much. But have you ever stopped and really thought about it? It's an odd thing we do, creating something that hasn't existed before. You know, marketing sits in the business college next to disciplines like management and finance and information systems. But it also needs a healthy dose of those liberal arts and sciences too, because as marketers, we are descended from Franz Kafka and Maya Angelou and George Orwell and Sylvia Plath and Charles Dickens and Shel Silverstein and on and on and on. We create just like them. As a host of the How I Made It in Marketing podcast, I've gotten to explore many angles of what it means to create. But we're reviewing a recent podcast guest application. I discovered yet another one, an itch we have not yet scratched on this podcast. Here's the lesson. Be the person who doesn't give up when things get complicated. Be the one to simplify them. Then your creative teams can do phenomenal things, something we all want. Describing that lesson, along with many more lesson-filled stories, today we have Jasmine Guthmann, Head of Corporate Communication at Contentstack. Thanks for joining us, Jasmine.
Thanks for the invite. Super glad to be here.
This is going to be a lot of fun. Let's first look at your background, very impressive background. I want people to understand who I'm talking to. Just cherry-picked from your LinkedIn. Starting as account director at Ogilvy and Mather, you moved on to be marketing manager for retail marketing at BlackRock. Now you are vice president at Mock Alliance and head of corporate communication at Contentstack, like I mentioned. At Contentstack, you lead a global team of 8 you built from scratch over the past 6 months. And your part of the marketing budget is $1 million that you manage. Contentstack itself has raised $89 million in funding over 3 rounds. And Mock Alliance is a nonprofit alliance of companies, 70 companies ranging in size from startups to Google. So give us an understanding here of what is your day like as head of corporate communication at Contentstack, but also as VP at Mock Alliance.
Yeah, thanks for asking, because those are 2 very, very different types of things. Of course, my day job and my main responsibility is with Contentstack and being a head of corporate communications over there. I lead a team of 8, as you mentioned, global, and that is super exciting, but also, sometimes a little challenging because we're all remote, we're distributed across the globe. And when my American friends get up in the morning, it's already almost time to go to bed for some of the other parts of the team who are based in Europe or India, or in some cases even in Australia and Sydney. So, getting all of these people together and aligned and rally them behind a cause to make things better and to simplify them so we can do phenomenal things instead of just cool things is what really excites me about my day job. And now add to that I have the absolute pleasure to have a side hustle because, as you said, the Mock Alliance is a nonprofit, so everyone does, except for a very, very small core team who's permanently employed, everyone donates a part of their time to advancing a cause that is important to us, and that is to advocate for best-of-breed composable architecture in the tech industry. And we all come together because we're driven and we're passionate. And yes, we're all scarce on time, but when we get together, we actually try to squeeze the most out of every second that we have. It's companies in size as small as the smallest startup that you can think of to the giants, Google and AWS, who just joined. So really interesting. You get to tap into a vast pool of resource and you get to work with brilliant, brilliant people. So very, very different. Sometimes similar, sometimes very different, but both are a lot of fun.
So I want to jump into your stories, but you said something that piqued my interest about, managing that global distributed team. Have you learned anything over the past 6 months, some best practices that you really need to do or some things you would avoid doing now that you've done it? Because I think one thing, personally, I started working from home during the pandemic. And I had back in the mid 2000s, and things changed some because like right now we can see each other, for example. And back in the mid 2000s, it was just you would hear the voice over the phone, and then when you finally met them in person, you're like, I didn't think they looked like that, But so do you have do you do offsites? Is there anything you do to like make sure, like you said, the two things we have is the tasks we need to do, but one thing I've learned is harder is those connections that used to happen more naturally, and with a global team, it's even harder. So anything you've learned from that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the biggest differences is while I was working at BlackRock back in the day, pre-COVID, pre-remote work, I was the biggest fighter for remote work because that wasn't a thing. It really wasn't. You were lucky if you could work a day from home, but then that was kind of almost seen as a favor that the company did you. Can you imagine? Fast forward to today where we are 100%, Contentstack is a 100% remote company. So now I'm a huge fighter for in-person meetings every once in a while. Of course, it's so much harder if you have a global team because getting everyone together is hard from a calendar perspective, expensive from a cost perspective. So it is a real investment, but it is the one that I'm most happy to make. There is something about meeting in person that you cannot replicate. It doesn't matter which tool you use. There's just this special feeling that you get for what a person is like and how you can actually get them to share a point of view or to not share a point of view, but you create that kind of connection that is impossible to create in a virtual setting. So that is the one thing I do fight hard for everyone to get together in person, even if it is a lot of work. And you really, really need to encourage people to be authentic and be able to work on their own, because sometimes time zone alone prohibits you from having a lot of time to do things together, or even for you as the manager to micromanage, which is the worst thing you can do in any setting. But it's even worse if you try to do it in a global setting, because it will not only really put your team members in a bad place, but it will also wear you out. If you're 24 hours working, you can only do that for so long, and you shouldn't. You really need to trust your team, build a team that is competent, that is better than you, best case. So, you're comfortable letting them run off and do what they're passionate about, and only every once in a while really have a need to check in and see what the great things that they've been up to.
Yeah, great point. Which, frankly, even when we were in an office together, is something we should have been doing as well, right? We shouldn't have been micromanaging back then either. But yeah, one thing I noticed when I had a team is, going on PTO is sometimes the best thing, because then they would have to figure it out. You know what I mean? Versus coming with the latest crisis and let's sit down, which is fine. But there's a benefit to that. So, all right, let's start by looking back at your career and talk about some of the lessons from the things you made in marketing. This is a really great thing about me, a marketer. I've never really been anything else, but think if you're a podiatrist or an actuary, you don't actually make things, but we make things. And so let's talk about one of the first lessons from the things you made. Be the person who doesn't give up when things get complicated. Be the one to simplify them. Then your creative teams can do phenomenal things. I mentioned this in the opening because this is a lesson from one of the coolest things I think we get to make, which is those creative campaigns. So this is back when you were at an agency. So tell us how you learned this lesson, Jasmine.
With pleasure. And it's a really, really good one too. I learned the tools of the trade as an account director in advertising in a in an owner-led agency that was part of the WPP network. So small agency, but big goals. And I quickly happened to become the financial services client specialist simply because I loved what most other ADs hated. Diving into the world of funds, derivatives, long-short options, all that, what I find fun, what other people hate because it's just too complicated, right? So in a world where everyone wanted the next fun beer commercial to produce, I was really a unicorn in a sense. And most others never made it beyond the first few introductory lines of a financial services client brief, let alone trying to translate that into something exciting and fun and something that would actually spark the creative juices, get the creative team excited, because you and I know that if you come with a boring brief, your creative team is just going to look at you like, yeah, and now what? So it's really the most important thing to understand something. You have to understand it first, and that's where many of my colleagues just struggled. So you need to understand what you're talking about, and then make it so simple. Really peel away all the layers until you get to the simplicity of it, and that's what you can beautifully hand over to the creative team and say, hey, what about this? This is exciting. This is what it will do. This is the impact it can have. Can we come up with something really, really extraordinary for this? So, we had a long-standing client, Fidelity, a huge company, a global company, very well known, and they sent through an ask for a campaign for an emerging markets fund. Half the account directors fled the hall, and they and I was like, awesome, yes, exciting. That's a brilliant one because it's tough. Let's see if we can solve for it. And so the creative team and I went back and forth to figure out, what the heck is the exciting part of an emerging markets fund? Who are we talking to? How can we get not just the creative team excited, but also the people on the receiving end of the communication? Sure, you could talk about diversification and potential for high growth, but that's not really tangible. It's hard to put into words, let alone images. But I kept coming back to the idea of the sheer potential that I saw in that offering. It wasn't just about dry possibility to get high profits because it's a high-risk investment, right? You don't want to hear that. It's like, okay, what else? Mm-hmm. It was really about engaging with the world's untapped resources with something yet undiscovered. So to me, there was a sense of adventure. And that's exactly when one of our junior designers, make no mistake, it wasn't the brilliant creative director, it's a junior designer who came up with the idea, why don't we use the visual of an iceberg, tip to bottom, and the headline saying, so much more than the eye can see. And the campaign really then, and that's what made it extra special, the campaign took on the theme of change of perspective. So we really tried to look at things, very common things, in very never before seen ways. The highlight being a video that, and I remember it to this day, I have it in front of my eyes. When played forward, it conveyed the message as negative. Equity investment is risky, blah, blah, blah. But played with the words in reverse order, using the exact same words, the text came across as a positive. I didn't think it was possible. We had a fantastic copywriter duo who did that, and to this day, I'm in awe on how they did it. What they did. So the campaign became the only one ever in the history of Fidelity to go through customer research with no changes recommended. I've never seen that after or before. Usually research tells you, oh, tweak this, maybe a little more of this. Not in this case. They were like, nope, spot on, don't change anything. And the person in charge at the time at Fidelity actually taped the research results to the wall in his office and kept it there for years. It was his personal best milestone ever, just as much as it was for us, to be really honest. And the junior designer actually went on to win several prizes for his campaign ideas and is a super successful creative director today, which makes me incredibly happy. Just seeing someone go through that development and career growth and having been part of that is really exciting as well.
That's awesome. There's two big lessons there that really strike me from what you said. One, for anyone looking to break into marketing or advertising, especially the creative side, it is hard. It's very difficult. And so I'm on the professional advisory board for the University of North Florida School of Communications, and I was speaking there recently. They have a media week, and they were asking me about, making their book, their portfolio, right? Because you need a portfolio usually to get a creative job. And one thing I advise, and it's advice I got from I remember Professor Elaine Wagner back 2-3 decades ago. She said, look, in your book, if you're doing some spec work, don't have Porsche and Harley. You know what I mean? Anyone can do awesome creative for Porsche and Harley Davidson, whoever. You find the most complex, most boring, possible potential clients. And if you create good work for that, that is gold, right? And you show up to interviews and spec work for that, because there are so many clients like Fidelity or like these complex B2B offerings, that still need that creative work. And there's so few people focused on it. They're focused on, the exciting fun things, Coca-Cola and whatever. But the other lesson too, for someone more advanced in their career, I love it's very meta because you talk about change of perspective. And I know that was your campaign for Fidelity, but that's actually also what you did for Fidelity. Mm-hmm. And me now in my career, when I've met with, it's a great thing about being in marketing, like you meet with these great entrepreneurs or big businesses or inventors or product creators, and they're creating value in the world. They're creating this amazing value, but their limit is they don't know how to communicate it well, so the customer perceives that value. And what you're able to do there, find that gold and dive into it and communicate it, like you're doing a service for them and really for the whole economy. You're taking this value they created, but they can't communicate it. And you're communicating it in a way that the customer can communicate it. So those are two big lessons. I love that story, Jasmine. Very helpful. Did want to ask one follow-up, though, because you talked about complexity. And this is something that I felt through my career, and I wonder your thoughts about it. One of the things I've really felt in my career was channel complexity, right? So when I started out, we did print ads in the Wall Street Journal or newspapers. There was direct mail. There was radio, TV. So, there were a few things. Websites were starting to have like a brochure website, but, there was only so much. And then, now there's so many channels. In addition to the traditional ones, oh my gosh, there's so many channels, new social networks coming every day. In addition to that, I was interviewed on SiriusXM by a Wharton professor named Catherine Hayes, and she wrote a book, Beyond Advertising, Creating Value Through All Customer Touchpoints. And then she brought up another great idea. Not only are all those advertising channels, there are all these other customer touch points too, where how do we create value? One of the coolest ads I saw was in Newark Liberty Airport, getting off the plane, and there was a coffee brand, I think it was called Illy, and they just had free coffee. Try it out. Don't go to that Starbucks. Here's some of the coffee for free. And but to get the free coffee, you need to take a picture in front of our Illy branded backdrop and share it on a social network with this hashtag or whatever, right? So there was multiple channels there. There was that in-person experience. That was a touch point with a human being. There was sharing through social. So anyway, I want to get your thoughts on that, on channel complexity. Like, what have you learned through your career today? You've clearly dealt with the complexity of, communicating, complex value offered by a company like Fidelity. How have you tackled channel complexity?
Let's start with saying channel complexity is the biggest challenge that all companies, but especially retailers, see over the course of the next 12 months, period. We all feel it. Now, what will differentiate the great companies from the not so successful ones is how you deal with that increased complexity and how your toolkit sets you up to be able to be really on your feet and see new things as they come and really tap into potential of those things. So channel complexity is increasing at a speed and a velocity that we've never seen before. Just think about the pink slip dress frenzy on TikTok. It was actually a short while ago. All of a sudden, your product is getting this crazy hype around it. So how do you respond? I think it's critical for every brand out there to have a very close look at their tech stack, how they are actually set up, and whether that's flexible enough. Because we know that with personalization, the demand is going to be increasing and increasing and increasing. You need to think about the customer first, because the customer, you and I, we don't care whether your tech stack is a problem. What we want to be able to do is buy effortlessly and across all of the platforms. If I see it on Instagram, I want to buy it on Instagram. I don't care whether your process likes me for that or not. I want to be able to do it. Fast forward to potentially 2045, and maybe my 3D printer at home is going to print the product upon my purchase from anywhere in the world. We don't know yet whether that's going to be the case, but we all need to be very honest and do a very honest inventory with our tools and processes and the ways we work to enable us to be quick, agile, even though I hate the word, but because it's been so misused and overused. But, really be flexible, have a flexible mindset, try new things, fail fast, learn quick, do it again. I think that is your only chance, really. But if you are open to that and if you utilize that, you have a phenomenal chance for success.
And to build on what you said, too, I think it's not to look at these different channels as separate silos, right? So the biggest successful retailers I've seen, the differentiation from the least successful retailers going on now when they have a brick and mortar location, is that combination of the brick and mortar and the online, right? There's some companies so seamlessly, there's a product online, you can see if it's in the store, you can go get it, you can go use it, you can buy it online, you can return it in the store, whatever. And there's some companies, and even if you reach out, I've had this experience as a customer, I reach out, and it's like they're two totally separate divisions and don't talk to each other. You know what I mean? So yeah, I totally agree. It's being able to have a seamless experience for the customer, and it's your job to figure out the back end to make that work, right? That's our job. Yeah. All right, let's take a look at your next lesson. You say the dangerous delusion of safety. Playing it safe can hurt you more than you know. So how did you learn that, Jasmine?
That was a hard lesson, but a very, as usual, the hard ones are the ones that you really need, right? So many companies and stakeholders, personally, the bigger the company, the more likely you're to see this, rely on an awful lot of external advice, right? Be it from the Big Four or research agencies or really any other external consulting service, because it creates safety for you, perceived safety, right? Oh, KPMG told me to do this, or the advice from over here was that. So it's not on me. I just followed advice that I received. And while many times I could tell why that was the case, because the environment was really almost hostile. But if you find yourself in an environment like that, my advice would always be to leave. I'm really honest. But that's wisdom I only learned over the years. So, right here, it's really important that even if you depend on that external advice, that is no guarantee for good results. Absolutely not. And here's the case to it. We had developed a campaign that featured a bat, the nocturnal animal, like Batman, that, as the key visual. And the research that we had to do, because the client insisted, came back unfavorable. So the research came back unfavorable. The focus group hated the bat. We launched the campaign with the recommended visual, recommended by the externals, and the performance was horrible. So we had done everything right. In theory, we listened to the advice, we changed it, and it was horrible. So in a really heroic moment, the client decided to be courageous and launch the original visual for an A/B test. And guess what? The original visual outperformed the recommended version, and not just a little, by a significant margin. And the story quickly went viral and serves as a reminder that there is no such thing as guaranteed safety. Not everything can be verified by data in advance. Sometimes you just have to ride the wave and trust your gut. But of course, all the while collecting data to see what works and who wins, you or the statistics.
Yeah, I mean, I love that story too, but I think it's also worth mentioning and separating out the type of data, right? Because you said something very key. I wrote this down. Action produces information. So the first data you're getting is focus group data, which can be helpful and you can learn things from it, but it's asking potential customers how they might act in a situation where they were using money. But then you used A/B testing, where it was real customers in a real situation. And so I think that's also understanding that sometimes we use words like testing or customer research or data, and we use them very broadly to broadly explain something when we really have to kind of dig in a little and understand what that data represents. And so I think that's a great example of that data that represented an opinion versus that data that was actually out in the real world representing, as you said, action produces information. I love that. But it all comes down to this, and really your next lesson is what we're trying to do is understand the customer. You said there's no way you can think your way into predicting what your customers need. Seriously, stop trying, which I loved. I also love the story behind this, how you pounded the pavement to learn what your customers wanted. We're not talking now about highfalutin focus groups or A/B testing. We're talking about getting out there. So how did you do this, Jasmine?
Well, we actually got out in the street. So here's the whole story. We were developing a campaign for Route 66. If you're not familiar with the brand, it's a low-budget cigarette brand, belongs to the Reemtsma empire. But really their lowest level brand option for people who are on a budget. And the task was to find out what that target audience, people on a budget, and many times from challenging backgrounds, were dreaming about. So we could offer that as the grand prize for a product promotion that we were heading into. And of course, I mean, we had brainstormed with the creative team, with the client, amongst ourselves, and we had a set of possible prices. And we wanted to validate which one was best. That's what we thought. So the whole executive team was flown into Leipzig, city in the east of Germany, and every exec got dropped off in front of a customer's house. Real customer, real house. And we were all handed a clipboard and a pencil and a set of interview questions. Scary as hell, I can tell you that.
I'm introverted. I'm very introverted. That does sound terrifying.
It is. And then you walk into a stranger's apartment and you're like, oh, wow. And it's not your reality. It's their reality. And it's one that you usually don't have access to. I will say that very, very upfront. So the result of that, both the survey and the exercise, was mind-boggling because the people we interviewed couldn't even imagine the things that we had brainstormed as prices. Not even when prompted. I remember sitting in a guy's living room, quote unquote, a table in part of his flat. And I said, well, what is the most fantastic thing that you can think of? And he looks at me somewhat puzzled and he's like, well, I think maybe if I could go to Croatia, which is basically next door, for a few days and bring a friend, that would be fantastic. And now I was puzzled and I looked at him and went, let's dream really big, you and I. Wouldn't you like to go on this fantastic trip on the Route 66 across the US? You get where I'm going. And he looks at me, he's like...
The branding would be so good. You understand that, right?
Right?
Don't you understand that?
And he looks at me, honestly, he looks at me and he's like, no, too far. Too complicated. And, when we got back together, everyone had basically had a similar experience. So the tension when we got back together as an executive team was really palpable. While before we were all 100% convinced that we knew what the target audience wanted, we had now all hit rock bottom and realized that our reality was really, really, really far away from theirs, from the customers. And it goes to say, know thy customer or thou shalt fail. Or, stop trying. Don't try to make assumptions. Even if you think you know what the target group wants, let the target group speak for themselves. Period.
I think that's great. Well, so one thing that has been so much fun about doing the How I Made It in Marketing podcast, like at Marketing Sherpa before, we've released nationally representative survey data where we surveyed customers about certain questions. And we surveyed marketers, and we called it the Marketer Consumer Disconnect Survey because it was funny how misaligned marketers and customers were. But that's at a holistic level. And it's been really interesting. There's been so many fun stories on the How I Made It Marketing podcast of marketers talking about, like, here was my assumption about a customer. And then, oh my gosh, I got to know the customers and realized I am not the customer. But, the great thing, I also want to differentiate between your previous story and this story, right? So in your previous story, you had a specific, it sounds like a specific ad treatment, specific ad campaign that you were showing to a focus group and they were giving feedback on it. And it's very funny when we do those things, not just because, as I mentioned before, there's a difference between behavioral data and opinion data. We're asking people who are not expert at this to give us feedback. But the other thing is we're also removing them from like their natural habitat, right? Like they're not going to experience that ad in a conference room with free lunch and a $50 spiff to do it. You know what I mean? They're going to experience it in their busy living room where their baby's crying and this is going on and they're thinking of this or that. And they're not going to focus so much on the creative execution. They're going to feel something very viscerally, quickly or not. But the difference, what you did with this research, which I really love, is you just went and tried to learn you went into their natural habitat to try to see what it was like, which was very different from yours. And you tried to get a sense of what they really wanted. You weren't, and they're expert in that. There's something they're very expert in. If you're talking about what potential grand prize would you want to win, they're very expert in that. Versus focus groups can have value, but versus saying, hey, we made this creative execution. How does the bat make you feel? Right. So that's beautiful. And I think anyway, we've all got different customers. Any way you can actually get in there, communicate with them. For the B2B side, it might be, going to those industry events, networking, there are all many things. Something I do, which I love doing, when you can't actually get and talk to the customer. Today, there's so many review sites and so much social media where the customers are naturally having conversations that we didn't used to get to eavesdrop on, right? It's like the conversations they would have with their neighbor. And that's been so helpful to me too, even as a writer, just getting that right word or two, because the way they talk about it is sometimes so different from the way we talk about it. But let's talk about now. So in the first half of the podcast, we talk about lessons from the things you made. The second half of the podcast, we talk about lessons from the people you made it with. Because that's what we do as marketers, right? We make things and we make them with people. And sometimes in your case, people all over the world, right? With your global team. But the first lesson here comes from Leonie Jansen, the founder and CEO of the Baas Company, BAAS. And she said, if you want it, don't be afraid to ask for it. Very nice. So what was going on in your career at the time where Leonie gave you that advice?
Oh, and I have to say up front that Leonie is one of the smartest, most incredibly passionate people that I've ever had the pleasure to meet. She and I really got together through the Mock Alliance, where she created the brand. BAAS stands for Branding as a Service. So that's what she does. She advises a lot of, especially these days, tech companies on how to be better, how to do better, how to really brand in a way that is memorable. And the situation that arose was we, had become close very quickly, which happens when you meet like-minded people. And that made me comfortable enough to share with her what was going on, really seeking her advice. So we're both females in a male-dominated industry. I hate that I even have to say that, but it's a fact, right? So when I felt I was being overlooked as the lead for a very important project, at first I just shrugged my shoulders and I thought to myself, well, if the company doesn't think that I'm qualified enough or that I should be leading it, then, maybe they're right. Maybe that's just the way it is. They'll find someone and then I'll wait for the next turn. Saying it out loud now makes me realize how weird that is. But, those are the things that are going on in our heads.
Absolutely.
So Leonie and I have a regular catch up, and I told her that. And she looked at me and she fiercely insisted that I was the right person to lead the project by any measure or criteria that you put on. And she started listing out why I was a great fit. And I just looked at her and went, it was almost disbelief, but I looked at her and said, you're right. But I still wasn't convinced that I should be doing anything about it. So she said, well, Jasmine, why don't you just ask to be considered? Yes, it would be more elegant if the company figured it out by itself, but think about it. A man in your position would never hesitate to raise his hand. And even if the outcome isn't you getting what you want, again, action produces information, you will learn a lot. And then you can act on that. At the very least, you asking directly will tell you where you're at. And then you can make decisions based on however the conversation goes. It's not so much about you getting a yes or you getting a no. It's about putting yourself out there, overcoming that fear of rejection that we all have, whether we like it or not, whether we admit it or not. And I was still hesitant. So we ended the call, and I kept debating in my head whether I should do it or not do it, or maybe this and maybe that. And
it's
sure
easy
enough,
for someone else
later,
to say that, right? And it's easy for someone else, easy for you to say, now let's see if I can do it. So what did you do?
Well, let's see here. I had this internal debate going on in my head. Should I do it? Should I not do it? If I do it, how do I do it? Oh, yeah, no, I don't think I should. Yes, I think I should. No, I shouldn't. And all while that's happening, an hour later, I get a WhatsApp message. And she's like, Jasmine, have you asked yet? I'm like, yeah, no, I'm still thinking about it. And she's like, well, I really think you should. I don't want to push you, but there's nothing to lose. And I kept going back and forth in my head, and I kept going. And then I texted her back, and I was like, you know what? You're right. I've made up my mind. I will ask. And she's like, great. If you need any help, or, whenever you get an answer, you let me know. And so I asked. And it really, really became clear to me that I wouldn't have done it if she hadn't asked, if she hadn't pushed me so hard, quote unquote, harder than most people would have, to do what's right. And sure enough, I spoke up, raised my hand, was eventually appointed to lead the project. And it really goes to say, we seldom regret the risk we took and failed. We usually regret the risk we failed to take. And we all need people in our lives like Leonie who challenge us to stand up for ourselves. Because to your point, it's so easy to say or to advise, but to actually go do it and put yourself out there and be vulnerable is much harder than it sounds.
Well, thank you for sharing that story, because I think so many times we stop ourselves, and really that gets to be, there's a bit of the nexus of what I'm trying to do with the How I Made It marketing podcast. Like I was telling you before, it would be easy to say these broad lessons and then blah, blah, blah. We can go on about these broad lessons, but to say how we've actually lived them, like you just did right there, that is beautiful. And I think hopefully that also opens up for a lot of people listening that might be in a similar position, that might have gotten that advice too, of like, anyone could give that advice. But to say that you've actually done it, that's a difference. And it was successful for you. It worked out.
I can only encourage people, build a support network. Keep in touch with people, even if you don't have something to work on directly, even if it's someone from a different company. But stay in touch. Be a listener when they need help, or just someone to tell. Sometimes even saying it out loud makes you realize how crazy that is, what's going on in your head, right? And really, if you see someone who should be raising their hand, or who, should be doing something but can't quite muster up the courage to do it, be the one who lends them a hand. Be the one to say, hey, I think you should be doing this. Of course, it's up to them to make a decision, but so many times, if I think back on my career, so many times I owe so many thank yous to people who saw something in me that I didn't see at the time, right? So for one, do thank the people that help you out and be the person who helps others. I think that is just a very beautiful, self-fulfilling prophecy then.
Absolutely. And thank you, Leonie, for that. But I want to tap into, so that's a great career lesson, but I want to tap into, because I think what you're talking about here really applies to our marketing as well. Because I hear some common themes here. You talked about fear and you talked about rejection. And so, as marketers, one thing I've learned is it's a beautiful thing, like I said in the beginning, we get to create. But as part of getting to create, we're not usually creating on our own, and there are the gatekeepers, and the gatekeepers are often the client. And depending where we are in the organization, we might be the client, but there's a CMO, there's a boss, there's someone involved. Even if you're in a very high position, there's the CEO, there's the board of directors, there's the analyst, there's the press, there's always the gatekeepers. And so I wanted to ask, you mentioned before a great example of fear where the organization didn't want to launch something because they saw a focus group specifically about your campaign. But a lot of fear I see too is we have all these kind of best practices and conventional wisdom. And I wonder if there's any time, you've had to overcome some of those best practices and conventional wisdom. So for example, we have a free digital marketing course. And in the session on website wireframes, Flint McLaughlin teaches, don't be afraid of long copy, be afraid of insufficient clarity. Right. And that's a great one because I always heard, long copy doesn't work. Or, I get this from designers like, I would never read all that. And, and I always have to say, well, who would read all that is someone interested in buying that product. You know what I mean? Like your example, like I always use the example, if your refrigerator broke that morning, like no one cares about reading long copy about a refrigerator. But if your refrigerator broke that morning, then you're kind of more interested in it. So that's just, one example. It's always that, the long copy one. But I wonder, have there been any times in your career, or you've had to push your team maybe, where there was like a best practice or a conventional wisdom where clearly you or your team or a client or your brand was holding itself back because of that conventional wisdom and you had to kind of push to overcome that fear? That's a common fear I see. It's a common fear of rejection too.
And I think we all see that every day. And I think all the common places and phrases can be like that, right? Videos shouldn't be longer than 2 minutes because nobody's watching. That's a pretty popular one. And I had to overcome that on a few instances, really, because it's something that is so popular as an opinion and gets repeated by everyone that no one ever questions it. To your point, while I agree for most promotional videos that, they should be short and to the point, there is other use cases where they cannot be and they should not be. If you're trying to build momentum and if you're trying to really create something exceptional that needs a lot of explaining, then it's just not possible to do it in that short a time frame. So I would always say, don't settle. Do not settle. We do a podcast that's called People Changing Enterprises, where we talk about just that. We talk to people who are change agents inside their companies. And those are the people that you want to work with. They are there. They're not necessarily always the top people, but there are people inside any enterprise that challenge the status quo, that say, and they are uncomfortable, right? If you are that person, you are uncomfortable to some other people because you're constantly pushing for other ways to do something. Do we have to send out a newsletter? Really, is that good enough as a reason, whatever you just gave me? Why is that? Can we split it up? Can we use other channels to get the message across? What is the message that we're trying to get across? Just because you've been sending newsletters doesn't mean it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's a great point. And change is one of the hardest things we can do, right? The status quo is tenacious. Things do not naturally want to change, right? You have to force a change onto them. That's just the nature of the universe. So yeah, I think that's a great point. Let's talk about this. This is the first ever on the How I Made It Marketing podcast. 2 lessons from one individual. So I love how there's 2 lessons here. This is Ian Forrest, Global Marketing Officer at New York Life Investments, and you learned large meetings are not for decisions, and be the calm in the storm. So this sounds like a very interesting meeting that you got 2 lessons out of it that you still remember to this day. So why don't you take us into this room?
Yeah, and that has made a lasting impression on me. And that was back at the time when we were both working for BlackRock. So Ian is an incredible leader, very pragmatic, also with a great sense of humor. And I think you'll see in a second why that was important. So he was my manager's manager at the time. And we were creating a brand new product campaign, financial services, complicated product, complicated process, large company. So a lot of moving pieces. And because of that, the global alignment process was incredibly slow and painful. But we were finally making good progress. So almost to celebrate, everyone from the campaign team to the creative agency to the production company for the TV ads, everyone flew into Frankfurt to finalize the creative and kick off the campaign. That was the plan. And for a while, everything seemed to be running smoothly until my boss at the time, who was a very emotional person and is to this day, and sometimes it's very beneficial for the group, but in this case, it wasn't. He got upset about a certain feature that the central creative team wanted changed. He got attached to it for some reason. And from there, it all went to hell within seconds. I've never seen that before. But you probably all have. We have all been in these meetings where everything seems fine, and then boom, all of a sudden the room is on fire.
Yeah.
And he wasn't willing to compromise. To this day, I wonder why that was, but he probably does too. And the central team felt put on a spot in front of everyone. So here's the large meeting component. Everything came to a grinding halt, which is when Ian stepped in and calmly but very firmly reminded everyone of their roles and responsibilities and the reason we had gotten together in the first place. So he called everyone to order and to the higher cause, made a decision right there for them, weighing the input everyone had been giving. And that really saved not just the day, but I think the whole project. And I learned 2 very valuable lessons right there and then. Number 1, large meetings are for sign-off, not for decision-making. The actual socialization of your ideas and the decision-making process both need to have happened in advance. And number 2, be the calm in the storm. Knowing how to de-escalate a highly emotional situation is one of the most valuable skills you can bring to the table. And by the way, also, just because someone is your line manager doesn't make them right or a role model. So be picky about whose advice you take and who you look up to, because it may not be your direct reporting line. Sometimes the best role models are to the side or, a little further away.
Yeah, those are 2 great lessons. I mean, one, about de-escalating. At the end of the day, we call this an organization or a company, but these are relationships. So we've got these complex relationships within organizations. And then when you bring in outside groups like vendors, especially multiple, sometimes competing vendors in some vendor ecosystems, they can escalate. So very smart leader to be able to de-escalate as opposed to be able to pit vendors against each other or people against each other. But the other lesson, which I really love, is large meetings are not for decisions. Some lesson I learned in my career is the most important meeting is the meeting before the meeting. You know what I mean? Like, some place that I see this, and I don't know how this is in Germany. I guess it's a parliament, but like in the American Congress, a lot of times they actually have a vote on a law. But usually 99% of the time, everyone knows how that vote's going to go before the vote actually happens, right? You read it in the newspaper, you know how that vote's going to go because there were probably multiple meetings before the meeting and people had everything lined up and it was kind of orchestrated. And so they knew it was going to go at that point. So as you said, it wasn't actually in there that the decision happened, though it looks like that. That's just the theater. It was the meeting before the meeting and all the hard work that happens beforehand to, as I mentioned, we are idea people. We are creators. We are creative people. We've got to get people along on that voyage, the right people in the right way, bring them along. So by the time we get to that point, like you said, it goes smoothly. Well, here's a final lesson. This is from earlier in your career. Don't be afraid to ask for better from your people, but make sure you walk the talk. And this was from Rebecca Biston, founder and CEO of Punch Fitness. So how did you learn this from Rebecca?
And this is really a time travel because this is actually my very first job. And Rebecca's the first boss I ever had, but she taught me a really basic lesson. And to your point, we talk about everything in a marketing context here, but so many of these can be applied to life in general, which is incredibly beautiful. Rebecca was running a gym at the time, and I had just started a dual study program to earn my degree in marketing. And that included working as a full-time employee at the gym, rotating through all different departments from admin, front desk, sales, marketing, weight training, aerobics classes. So I did it all. And, it's a real general manager array of tasks and responsibilities. And to this day, I believe you need to do something like this. It's almost similar to visiting your customers to understand what's important for the business, right? You need to know all the nuts and bolts before you can make decisions about how to put them together. And the customers loved Rebecca because she always put their best interest at the heart of everything she did. And she insisted on small details. I vividly remember that the promotional posters had to be taped to the wall invisibly with the strips folded behind the poster instead of taping it across the corners. She would rip the poster off if she saw something like this. And she would find the person who'd done it, and then you were in trouble. And it seems small, but to her, that was one of the ways she expressed caring in her philosophy about things. We do pay attention to the small details so you have a great experience. And the first thing she did when she came in, every time, no matter time of day or day of the week, was to do her round through the club, entrance, changing facilities, weights area, classrooms, her office. And if she found anything that didn't meet her standards, she'd fix it immediately, which included cleaning the showers if necessary. And, she really walked the talk. No matter her pay grade or her perceived being the boss, and she was the boss. And she held everyone in the team accountable to the same standard. So very quickly, she installed that same sense for what's important in everyone who became a permanent member of the team. Not a single member of the team would not do what she did. So we all we took extra care that everything held up to the high standards that she implemented. And she also taught me how to turn something that's about to be written off as a loss into a tool to increase revenue. Now, here's a fantastic lesson. The gym was selling shakes and bars at the front desk, so basically food and beverages. And that part of the business was, as many times, the one with the highest margins, but also one that absolutely depended on whoever stood behind the bar to up and cross-sell. So we all know bars and shakes have an expiration date, and we had to do inventory every morning and every evening to account for the number of items sold and what was going to be expiring. And one morning, I was on front desk duty. Rebecca comes in. You get that urge thinking, oh God, I hope everything is as clean as she wants it to be because I did my round, but it's a half hour in between. I hope fingers crossed. But that went fine. But she now decides she wants to check the inventory. She does. And she finds a box of expired bars. And she gets pretty mad and gives me a lecture about how I could have used that box of bars a few days before as free samples to sell them off before they expired, rather than just having them sit there waiting to expire and not doing any good. Pretty intense lesson right there. But it stuck. So, and I learned fast. So the next time I came across a box of bars about to expire sitting in the inventory, guess what I did? I unwrapped them, I cut them up, I used them as trials, as free samples, sold off as many as I could. And the great thing is, when she came in that day and walked up to the reception and saw that I had done that, here's what made all the difference. She told me how proud she was of me for doing that. And that feeling cannot be bought with money. And I've never forgotten that.
You know, one thing that really strikes me about this, all these many years later, I won't ask how many, but is you still remember her habits, like that habit of going in and like the round she would make, and how that like instilled something in you. And so I wonder, as you've gone on to become a leader, are there any habits that you've picked up or you've used or try to get your team to use? Because one thing that really struck me about habits, which I'd never really thought about before, is I'd interviewed Charles Duhigg. He was a New York Times reporter, and he wrote a book about the science of habit formation. And he really went into how much of our day is made up of habits and how we can optimize those habits. And he has a great story in there about what kicked off the book for him is he would eat a cookie every day. He would go in the break room at 3 p.m. every day and eat a chocolate chip cookie. And one day he realized he was gaining some weight, didn't even want to eat a chocolate chip cookie. Why was he even doing this? Or he talks about when we back out of our garage with our car in the morning, there's a series of habits that go on that you don't even think about. You put your car in reverse, you look behind you, you open the garage, all these things. And these are part of our life that, we don't think about. But to your point, I had never thought before of how others see those habits. I just kind of thought of it as internally. Mm-hmm. So that was a great example with Rebecca. And I wonder for you, like now in your career as a marketing leader, as a business leader, are there any habits that you try to visibly show your team or that you try to instill in your team? Or how have you used habits to, I think you said that to walk the talk?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really boils down to walking the talk, which means, and interesting enough, just spoke to Danielle de Liberty, fantastic female leader in the industry, who said a similar thing. Only demand of your team what you're willing to do yourself. So if I ask you to show up late or at a late time to a call, I can only do that if I am willing to do the same. If I'm not willing to do what I'm about to ask you, my credibility, to our earlier point, becomes lower. And it's all about credibility, especially in a remote work environment. You need to trust me that I will hold my promises. If I say I fight for you, I need to fight for you. And if I ask you to do something, I need to be willing to do the same myself. I think that's my number one rule, and that's what I try to do every day. And I see it working beautifully with the team. And a habit that I've formed with the team, which is super exciting to me, because here's, applying things that you read in books can be hard. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But an idea that I read and that I then tried out with the team is we start our weekly team meeting with a gratefulness exercise. So we don't start diving right into, here's our task list and who's doing this and when is this due. We start with, hello, fellow human being.
Yeah.
Tell us one thing that you're grateful for today. And we go around the table. You would not believe the depth of answers that have started to come up over time. At the beginning, and sometimes even today, someone doesn't quite feel it and is like, yeah, I'm happy I have a cup of coffee. And that's fine. That's totally fine. But for some people, this has been such a fantastic opportunity to share more about them and really connect with the rest of the group. And it's really been one of the most powerful team building tools, if you want to think about it that way, that I've come across. And funny enough, I couldn't make a few of the team meetings because of other clashes, and I was kind of wondering if they would stick to it, right? Because if I'm not there, they don't have any obligation to do it. I was the one who wanted it. You could have gone both ways. But it actually turns out they love it so much, they would rather skip the rest of the meeting and spend more time up front. So,
do you remember what book that was? Because that is a great point. One thing we talk about is getting the marketer in the right mindset. Because we said that so much to creativity and to serving customers and all these things. It's not just about doing a bunch of tasks like we work in a factory. It's getting in that right mindset to really produce. So I wonder, you remember what book that was?
Yeah, I think it's Atomic Habits by James Clear, which is a fantastic book to read in any case, but that especially resonated.
Great lesson if anybody wants to pick up that book. But so we talked about so much, Jasmine, all these different things about what it means to be a marketer, to be so customer focused, to have these right habits. If you had to break it down, what are the key qualities of an effective marketer?
Curiosity, open-mindedness, and a passion to drive. And also take time to look in a rear view mirror every once in a while. I think that's how I would sum it up.
Well, thanks for taking the time to look in the rearview mirror of your career with us today. You mentioned things we're grateful for. I'm grateful for this conversation. That's the thing I'm grateful for today. So thank you, Jasmine.
Thank you, Daniel. Pleasure for me as well.
And thank you to everyone for listening and lending us your ear today.
Thank you for joining us for How I Made It in Marketing with Daniel Burstein. Now that you've gotten inspiration for transforming yourself as a marketer, get some ideas for your next marketing campaign from Marketing Sherpa's extensive library of free case studies at marketingsherpa.com. That's marketingsherpa.com.